Americans would die without Mexico. Nearly every pacemaker used by heart patients in the U.S. was manufactured in Tijuana, and the pacemaker is not unique. The greater Tijuana-San Diego region is the largest hub of medical device manufacturing in the world. Tijuana employs nearly 40,000 medical manufacturing employees, who generate about $3 billion worth of exports every year. Across the border in San Diego, nearly 100,000 citizens are employed in the medical device industry. Most of the Mexican production plants are owned by U.S. companies, with their corporate headquarters just across the border in San Diego. And the more complex a medical device, the more likely it needs components that can only be built in the U.S. When Mexico exports a product to the United States, there is a 25% chance that it was built with at least one component produced in the U.S. Without this bilateral collaboration, medical care in the continent would be lower quality and more expensive. But medical devices are one of the smaller byproducts of North American dynamism. Auto manufacturing, electronics, aerospace, petroleum goods, and food are all industries that are deeply intertwined across the border. Despite this economic synergy, trade between Mexico and the United States is relatively new, and the two young nations had quite a turbulent relationship for most of their history. But things began to turn around in the mid-20th century. This is how it happened. Global trade completely changed in the aftermath of World War II. As the United States emerged as a new superpower, Washington crafted a global economic strategy with an ambitious goal: use trade to achieve peace. With trade, resource wars became completely unnecessary. After all, it is far cheaper to send cargo ships as opposed to invading armies. Each nation can produce what they can the best, and trade for the rest. But Mexico wasn't on board with this plan, and instead pursued an isolated, deglobalized economy. Mexico was considerably under-industrialized during this time, and for good reason. Mexico is rich with an abundance of natural resources. For most of its history, Mexico would export raw materials and import manufactured goods. This worked well enough during times of stability, but made Mexico quite vulnerable during global shocks, particularly during the Great Depression. During the Depression, Mexico had few markets to export their raw materials, and with a small domestic industry, Mexico was hit hard during the Great Depression. After the Depression, Mexico decided to isolate itself in order to protect and promote domestic industrialization, but Mexico briefly returned to exporting during the Second World War. A few months after Pearl Harbor, Mexico opened its markets to their northern neighbor. Mexico provided the U.S. with a tremendous amount of raw materials, which aided the U.S. in their war effort. But by the war's end, Mexico returned to an isolationist economy. Mexico had a tremendous amount of tariffs and import quotas, making it difficult for the rest of the world to sell their goods in Mexico. As expected, most of the world tariffed Mexican goods as a response. Additionally, Mexico would cease to export their oil. Better to keep domestic prices low to stimulate industrialization. Mexico declared to the world that they were closed for trade. With few exceptions, very little goods entered or exited Mexico's borders. While the two neighbors were pursuing opposite economic policies, both enjoyed success in the 1950s and 60s, especially in the case of Mexico. Mexico would achieve GDP growth of about 6% per year during this isolationist period. Mexican economic growth was performing so well that economists named it the Mexican Miracle. But the 1970s would bring dramatic changes to North America. In 1973, war broke out between Israel and a coalition of Arab nations. Israel shocked the world by securing a quick and decisive victory in just a few weeks, in large part due to military aid from the United States. In turn, the Arab nations significantly reduced their oil exports to the US and their allies. This caused oil prices to quadruple in a short matter of time. The 1970s would prove to be a challenging decade for the United States. Due to high oil prices and poor responses from the government and the Federal Reserve, most U.S. citizens would face economic hardship in the 70s. The U.S. suffered a rare economic condition known as stagflation, which is when high inflation is paired with high unemployment. In 1975, Inflation in the US measured at 11%, and unemployment totaled 9%. Prior to this crisis, most economists believed that high inflation and high unemployment could not be experienced at the same time. This economic crisis would be known as the Great Malaise. Mexico would also go through a radical change in the 70s, but in a much more positive direction. Mexico discovered an ocean of new oil reserves, and with oil prices so incredibly high, Mexico decided to start exporting their oil again. These conditions brought in a ton of money into the nation, and the government owned most of the new revenue. In Mexico, the government owns all the oil, which meant that the government received all the proceeds from the oil boom. With this new cash, the Mexican government expanded social services, specifically healthcare and education. But the government also increased its presence into other areas of the economy. The Mexican government would purchase private companies and convert them into state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. Instead of being accountable to shareholders, SOEs are accountable to the government. And given that the government was rich from oil exports, Mexican SOEs did not need to be profitable. Instead of seeking profits to maintain financial stability, Mexican SOEs would be subsidized with oil cash. This economic environment allowed Mexico to have low unemployment, but also permitted a notable amount of corruption. Nonetheless, Mexico's new economic model could be sustainable as long as oil prices remained high. Meanwhile, in the US, voters were becoming frustrated with the traditional way of doing business. With high inflation, weak stocks, and a poor job market, US citizens wanted a radical change to boost the economy. But instead of trying something new, voters wanted to try something old. Neoliberalism started to gain popularity across the nation. This economic philosophy leans heavily on the ideas proposed by Adam Smith, but is repackaged for the modern era. Neoliberalism is all about freedom, free movement of goods across borders, free movement of people across borders, low taxes, low welfare benefits, privatizing state-owned enterprises, reducing government oversight of the economy, deregulation, and implementing right-to-work laws that weaken unions. Near the end of his first term, President Jimmy Carter embraced neoliberalism and started to put it into practice. Carter deregulated the airlines, trucking, railroads, banking, and the financial sector. Carter's deregulation helped curb inflation and enhance modernization, but came at the expense of jobs, particularly union jobs. In any case, Carter's pivot to neoliberalism was not enough to help him win re-election, and he would be replaced by Ronald Reagan, who doubled down on neoliberalism. Reagan slashed taxes, reduced government-provided benefits, maximized deregulation, and was quite combative with federal employee unions. As a true neoliberal, Reagan wanted to expand the US trade network, particularly with Mexico and Canada. Reagan envisioned a North American Accord, where the big three North American nations could easily access each other's markets. Reagan envisioned that a united North America would create an economic powerhouse, benefiting all three nations. But Mexico was not interested in Reagan's North American dream. Mexico was quite satisfied with the status quo, as the nation was enriching itself due to high oil prices. Everything was going great for Mexico, until the Mexican miracle turned into a nightmare. In the 1980s, oil prices began to fall, and completely crashed by mid-decade. Oil glut had arrived, and this was very bad news for Mexico. The Mexican economy was propped up by expensive oil, and high oil prices were long gone. Mexico's oil revenues fell by nearly 50% between 1981 and 1986. Pair this with high interest rates and a high national debt, and Mexico found itself in a very difficult situation. To keep state-owned enterprises operational, Mexico began to print large amounts of pesos. As expected, this created a painful amount of inflation, which peaked at 159% in 1987. Per capita GDP fell by 9%, real wages dropped by about 40%, public services were slashed by 30%, unemployment rose dramatically, and the poverty rate nearly doubled. Much of Mexico's middle class was completely wiped out. This was a very rough time for Mexico, and became known as the Lost Decade. And just like the United States, Mexico pursued neoliberal economics to save them. In 1988, Mexico elected Carlos Salinas as president. although there are some serious disputes about the legitimacy of this election. In any case, Salinas ushered in the era of neoliberalism for Mexico. State-owned enterprises were privatized, union bosses were arrested, and foreign companies were enticed to invest in Mexico. But Salinas' crown achievement was the creation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. In a sharp contrast to Mexican tradition, Salinas reached out to the United States to create this free trade agreement. The US eagerly accepted, and wanted to go as far as creating a gracious immigration policy between the two nations. But Salinas declined to include immigration as part of the deal, famously declaring that Mexico would export goods, not people. Despite the immigration disagreement, the free trade deal passed. Salinas was transitioning Mexico from an isolationist economy into a globalized economy. But to maximize Mexico's potential, the nation needed foreign investment. To attract foreign investors, Salinas devalued the peso, but the peso devaluation plan worked far too well, and the peso crashed much more than Salinas intended. This created a new economic crisis for Mexico, known as the Tequila Crisis. But the United States opted to help out their southern neighbor. Bill Clinton provided Mexico with a rescue package valued at $40 billion, when adjusted to today's value. While the tequila crisis did cause sharp and severe pain to the Mexican economy, the US rescue package limited the duration of this crisis. Mexico was able to repay the entirety of the bailout within 6 years. The tequila crisis, and a few other scandals, disgraced the legacy of Carlos Salinas, which I covered in greater detail in this video. Today, Salinas is wildly unpopular in Mexico, and many consider him to be one of the worst presidents in Mexican history. Mexicans were questioning if neoliberalism was right for them. In any case, NAFTA made the economies of these two neighbors deeply intertwined, and possibly inseparable. The year 2000 would be one of optimism for these neighboring nations. Both countries were holding presidential elections, and the new presidents were quite fond of their neighbor. The US elected George W. Bush, who speaks Spanish.
¿Dónde aprendió español?
Aquí en Texas. Hay muchos mexicanos americanos que viven aquí y también es mi escuela del junior high, también en high school. Estudié español. Es un idioma muy grande, es un idioma muy importante aquí en este.
Bush often touted his ties with Mexico. As governor of Texas, he frequently visited neighboring Mexican states to improve political relationships and spur economic development. Bush has a Mexican sister-in-law and made many Mexican colleagues throughout his business and political career. From the beginning, Bush established himself as a Mexican-friendly president. On the other side of the border, Mexico elected Vicente Fox, who had close ties to the US. Fox spent some of his teenage years in Wisconsin, allowing him to become perfectly fluent in English. As the new president of Mexico, Fox envisioned much deeper ties with the US. Fox wanted NAFTA to be elevated from a trade agreement to a full-blown customs union. If enacted, this would mean that Canada, the US, and Mexico would all have a unified tariff policy for goods that are imported to North America. This would force the three nations to work closer together and make them all stronger on the global stage. With Fox and Bush in office, it seemed that US-Mexico relations would reach new highs. But then 9/11 happened, and it ruined everything. The attack completely upended US foreign policy, and the US was much more focused on the Middle East, as opposed to North America. Mexico was given the cold shoulder, and the relationship worsened when the Iraq War started. From the beginning, Fox was strongly opposed to the Iraq War. During this time, Mexico had a seat on the UN Security Council and would use their position to condemn the US invasion of Iraq.
Amigas y amigos, paisanas, paisanos, estamos contra la guerra.
This created tensions between Bush and Fox, and the dream of the North American Customs Union died over Iraq. Nonetheless, Bush was still a neoliberal, and arguably the last neoliberal to occupy the White House. He attempted to expand legal immigration for Mexicans who wanted to enter the US. Additionally, Bush wanted to create a pathway to citizenship for unauthorized Mexicans living north of the border.
You cannot fully enforce the border so long as people are trying to sneak in this country to do jobs Americans aren't doing. But doesn't it make sense to help the Border Patrol do their job by saying, if you're going to come and do a job, there is a legal way to do it? There are some who, I don't know if they say this explicitly, but they certainly allege or hint that probably the best way to deal with 11 to 12 million people is to get them to leave the country. That's impossible. That's the kind of statement that sometimes happens in the political process, aimed to inflame passion, but it's completely unrealistic. It's not going to happen.
To rally domestic support, Bush famously declared that family values don't end at the Rio Grande, but Congress despised the plan. Both Democrats and Republicans rejected Bush's immigration agenda, and it was killed in the Senate with a bipartisan agreement. When Obama took office, he would be much harsher on immigration. Obama would oversee more deportations than any other US president. In fact, Obama would execute more deportations than the sum of all presidents of the 20th century. Neoliberals and immigration rights activists would brand Obama as the deporter-in-chief. Immigration aside, enough time had passed for both Mexico and the US to analyze the effects of NAFTA. On the macro level, free trade benefited both nations, but it did cause some hardship to certain sectors in both countries. In the US, NAFTA was a harsh blow to the already declining manufacturing industry. US manufacturing was already suffering with the rise of East Asia and improved automation technology, and NAFTA only accelerated the decline of manufacturing jobs. Both entry-level apprentices and highly skilled mechanical engineers were hurt by NAFTA. In Mexico, small corn farmers were wiped out due to the free trade agreement. The US subsidizes domestic corn production, giving them an unfair advantage in the Mexican market. This forced many small Mexican farms to abandon their way of life and seek jobs in industrialized cities. Additionally, Mexico's benefits from NAFTA weren't evenly distributed. Most of the gains from the free trade agreement were concentrated in the north, as this provided simpler supply chains for US clients. These realities created some resentment towards NAFTA in both nations. In the US, this crystallized into the election of Donald Trump in 2016. While campaigning, Trump was quite critical of NAFTA, and Mexico in general. In Mexico, a longtime politician known as AMLO had fierce anti-NAFTA sentiment earlier in his career. AMLO had a long history in Mexican politics, and it seemed certain that he would be elected president in 2018. With these two populist figures, it seemed that NAFTA was on the chopping block, but Trump would be pressured by the agriculture and automotive sector to keep free trade alive. As AMLO was campaigning for president, he too softened his stance on NAFTA. In 2017, the three nations decided to replace NAFTA with a new deal which is called the USMCA in the United States and TMEC in Mexico. But in all actuality, there were only a few differences in the new trade deal. But with a shiny new name, both Trump and AMLO were able to declare victory despite the minuscule amount of change. For that reason, I'm still going to refer to the trade deal as NAFTA. It would seem that this would put an end to the discussion of US Mexico relations. But not quite. About a year after the new NAFTA was signed, Trump threatened Mexico with tariffs. Unless Mexico assisted with Trump's immigration plan, Trump wanted the Remain in Mexico policy to be in full effect. In the past, a foreign asylum seeker could walk up to the US border, claim asylum, and reside in the US while immigration courts process their claim. In a significant number of cases, the asylum seeker neglected their court obligations and remained in the US without permission. Trump wanted to put an end to this and force asylum seekers to remain in Mexico while their asylum claim was being processed. And if Mexico didn't agree, they would face high tariffs. AMLO could have challenged Trump's tariff threats within NAFTA's dispute mechanisms, but chose to give Trump what he wanted instead. While there was a lot of bluster during these tariff threats, US-Mexico relations remained mostly stable afterwards. This is despite the fact that most asylum seekers are not Mexican. This new deal meant that Mexico would host foreign asylum seekers as they awaited permission to enter the US. But AMLO's agreement to remain in Mexico was only mildly controversial. It did put strains on Mexican border towns, but it didn't really hurt AMLO's sky-high approval ratings. As for Trump, the Remain in Mexico policy would prove to be quite effective at reducing asylum applicants in the US. When Biden took office, he removed Trump's Remain in Mexico policy, When Remain in Mexico was nullified, it proved to be a political disaster for Biden. Asylum applications on the border surged, and immigration courts were drowning with new applications. Illegal crossings at the border increased significantly under the Biden administration. Meanwhile, AMLO is crafting to get a win of his own. AMLO has long been a proponent for small Mexican farmers, and it was time to deliver some results. AMLO passed a decree that would eventually ban GMO corn for human consumption. This directly threatened corn exporters in the US, as about 90% of the US corn exported to Mexico is classified as GMO. The GMO corn ban did carry some cultural undertones as well. Corn as we know it simply would not exist if not for the indigenous peoples of Mexico. It is a commodity of pride for most Mexicans. And as most corn consumed in Mexico is actually grown in the US, it did not sit well with patriotic Mexicans. It would be as if France imported most of their baguettes from England. In any case, AMLO's anti-GMO corn decree would need some clarifications, making it a project for Mexico's next president. "2024 was an election jubilee for Mexico and the US, as both nations were having presidential elections, an event which only occurs once every 24 years. In Mexico, AMLO handed the torch to Claudia Sheinbaum. Riding on the popularity of AMLO, everyone expected Sheinbaum to win the presidency, but the world was shocked by how well she won. Sheinbaum exceeded her already high expectations and claimed 61% of the vote in a three-person race. Additionally, her political alliance dominated the parliament elections, winning more seats than anyone anticipated. Sheinbaum and her political coalition have almost enough seats to rewrite the Mexican Constitution at will. Sheinbaum's success defied the global trend of 2024 elections. In nearly every election in the world, incumbent parties lost power largely due to inflation anxiety, but Sheinbaum won the heart of the Mexican people and increased her party's power. I covered this election in more detail in this video if you want to learn more. But things would be quite different on the northern side of the border. Analysts expected a tight election between Trump and Harris. But Trump overperformed on election night to reclaim the White House, and his Republican Party would hold a slim majority in Congress. Trump's victory was in large part due to anxiety over the border. One would expect U.S. Mexico relations to be fairly stable in 2025. After all, Trump and AMLO were able to work out their differences, and with Sheinbaum being from the same party, one would think that things would work out fairly well, but that has not been the case. Sheinbaum continued the fight to ban GMO corn in Mexico. To comply with NAFTA rules, Sheinbaum claimed that GMO corn presented a public health risk in Mexico, which would grant her authorization to ban US-grown GMO corn. The US agricultural industry quickly objected to the claim and pursued the dispute mechanisms established in the new NAFTA. A NAFTA tribunal ruled that Mexico's health claims about GMO corn was insufficient, and that they must keep their markets open to US-grown GMO corn. Sheinbaum disagreed with the ruling, but chose to respect it, and hinted that the fight over corn isn't settled just yet.
Mexico is intrinsically linked culturally by our origin, by what our native peoples of yesterday and today are, and the resistance with corn. Corn is Mexico. That is why it is said that without corn there is no country, so protecting Mexico from planting transgenic corn is fundamental.
But Sheinbaum extended an olive branch to the US. In anticipation of the new Trump administration, Sheinbaum increased enforcement on the border to reduce the flow of fentanyl. These were successful actions, and the Presidenta shared this infographic with the White House. But this was not enough to appease the new US president. Trump deployed a whiplash of on-again, off-again tariffs against Mexico during his first few months in the White House. The US stock market has not responded well to Trump's tariff agenda. Since his inauguration, the US stock market has lost over $4 trillion in value. An editorial from the Wall Street Journal called Trump's tariff actions the dumbest trade war in history. This coming from a newspaper that endorsed him for president. Despite the initial shocking headlines and market pains, things are hopefully smoothing out between the US and Mexico. Sheinbaum has gone to great lengths to keep free trade alive. She sent an additional 10,000 National Guard soldiers to the border increased Mexican tariffs on China, and changed extradition procedures to hand over cartel operatives to the U.S. In turn, Trump has sung praise for Sheinbaum and speaks fondly of her in press briefings.
And I spoke to the President of Mexico, wonderful woman, today, and we helped them out with a problem they were having to do with the tariffs, short-term tariffs. And we had a very good conversation. Spoke with the President of Mexico, very nice woman, very fine woman.
Recently, Sheinbaum attended a giant rally in the heart of Mexico City. In the one-hour speech, Sheinbaum declared the end of the trade war and continued cooperation with the U.S.
Porque en la relación con los Estados Unidos, con su gobierno, prevaleció el diálogo y el respeto, y fueron levantadas las tarifas o aranceles que se estaban aplicando a productos que exportamos hacia el vecino país. México seguirá colaborando para evitar que llegue fentanilo a los jóvenes estadounidenses.
While the Trump-Sheinbaum saga is far from over, I believe there's legitimate reason for optimism for both nations. At the time of this writing, the tariffs on Mexico are paused, with the exception of steel and aluminum. With that in mind, if you enjoyed this video and thought it was helpful, I would like to ask you for a quick favor. If you want to support this style of journalism, please consider becoming a patron. Patron support is the lifeblood of this channel, and allows me to devote more time to research. You can join by scanning the QR code, or by following the link in the description. It is completely voluntary, and is just a way for people to support this type of work. Thank you, and see you next time.